In 1854, Randolph Rogers, a young American sculptor full of ambition and self-reliance, left his studio in Rome to return to the U.S. in search of opportunities for public commissions. Aware that his close expatriate friend in Rome, Thomas Crawford, had been hired by Captain Montgomery Meigs, the construction superintendent in charge of selecting artists to decorate the new expansion of the Capitol building, Rogers visited Washington with a detailed plan of his own. He presented a proposal to Meigs for bronze doors celebrating the life of Columbus. Rogers based his design on the famous Gates of Paradise created for the Florence Baptistry by the early Renaissance artist Lorenzo Ghiberti. Each of the 10 panels on Ghiberti's doors utilized the newly invented science of linear perspective to create the illusion of receding space on a two-dimensional plane. To heighten the spatial depth of his biblical scenes, Ghiberti sculptured foreground figures in high relief while rendering background figures in low relief. Another of the artist's innovations placed 20 Old Testament prophets and sibyls in niches on the sides of each panel, flanked by medallions with 24 protruding busts above and below each narrative scene. Adopting the Florentine masterpiece as his template, Rogers aimed to incorporate all of Ghiberti's innovations on his doors for the Capitol, including busts of Washington Irving and William H. Prescott, two Americans who wrote extensive histories of Columbus and his era. To convince Superintendent Meigs of his artistic worthiness, Rogers showed him a photo of his first acclaimed sculpture, Ruth Gleaning. Rogers' neoclassical statue of a biblical symbol of selflessness and devotion, kneeling in a barley field, perfectly suited mid-century Victorian tastes. A marble completed before his return to the U.S., Nydia, the blind flower girl of Pompeii, won even more recognition, becoming the most popular American sculpture of the 19th century. Fleeing the eruption of Vesuvius, Rogers' tragic heroine with her hand cupped to her ear showcased the artist's talent for storytelling. Impressed with this youthful virtuosity, Meigs recommended Rogers to his superior, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. If he can succeed as well with these as with his Ruth, it will be well enough. After receiving the commission for the bronze doors in May 1855, Rogers returned to his studio in Rome to begin modeling the reliefs for the project. Basing the narratives of his doors on the heroic mariner heavily fictionalized in Washington Irving's immensely popular 1828 biography, Rogers explained that, with the exception of George Washington, no one's name was more intimately connected with the history of our country and better deserves a lasting monument to his memory than Christopher Columbus. For 19th century Americans, the story of our country, all the pride and glory of the New World, began with his discovery. They readily connected the perilous crossing of the Atlantic in 1492 with the spirit of the frontier and the expansion of Western civilization, the very theme Thomas Crawford allegorized in his frieze for the Senate's East Front pediment. Like Crawford, Rogers strove to incorporate the same theme by endowing Columbus with enterprising traits an American audience could identify with. The 19th century image of Columbus depicted on Rogers' doors personifies the characteristics attributed to him in Irving's biography. As we shall see, the great navigator exhibits exceptional fortitude and perseverance. He is scientific and practical, and above all, a man of genius blessed with visionary powers. All these heroic qualities combine in the first panel of Rogers' narrative showing the Council of Salamanca. Before a gathering of astronomers, geographers, mathematicians, church dignitaries, and learned friars at a Dominican convent in the famous university town of Salamanca in 1487, Columbus attempts to prove his theory of a new westward route to Asia. Boldly standing in the center of the composition, the self-taught mariner from Genoa points to a chart of his proposed voyage, while the scholars convened at the request of Queen Isabella study his proof. Most members of the commission strongly disagreed with his calculation that the distance from Europe to the Orient was only around 2,000 nautical miles, an error of nearly 10,000 nautical miles. The same doubts had been raised in the courts of King John II of Portugal, King Henry VII of England, and King Charles VIII of France, when Columbus and his brother Bartholomew presented their enterprise of the Indies plan in an attempt to secure royal financing. No ship of the day, learned men of the period concluded, could possibly sail across such a vast tract of uncharted ocean. We can better imagine how Columbus envisioned a new passage to India, China, Japan, and the Spice Islands from a map the Florentine cosmographer Paolo Toscanelli sent him in 1481, a map which greatly encouraged his dreams of duplicating the exploits of Marco Polo. Patiently waiting for a favorable decision from the rulers of Spain, Columbus persisted, undaunted by the opposition he encountered. Emulating Ghiberti's design, Rogers placed statuettes of all the monarchs approached for support by the Columbus brothers in niches on the sides of each door panel. The second panel in Rogers' narrative captures the moment of destiny when Columbus was summoned from the Franciscan Convent of La Rábida to renew his discussions with King Ferdinand and Isabella, who had placed his proposal on hold for 6 long years. From an artistic perspective, in my opinion, this panel is Rogers' most successful composition, combining masterful modeling with the fine detail of Ghiberti's doors. As Columbus prepares to depart on his journey to the court, he bids farewell to his close friend and protector, Friar Juan Perez. Over the course of 7 years since Columbus's arrival in Spain in 1484 or 1485, Perez provided asylum in La Rábida for the destitute navigator and his young son, Diego, who is depicted on the entrance steps of the convent playing with a dog. Entrusting his 12-year-old son to the care of the Franciscan friars, Columbus takes his leave of Perez, secure in the knowledge that his most faithful supporter has arranged everything for his reception at the royal encampment. Without Friar Perez's close court connections as the former confessor to Queen Isabella, it is doubtful Columbus would have succeeded in gaining a second, much less a third audience with King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in 1491 and 1492. After all the doubts raised by the sages of Salamanca, the Genoese mariner needed the intervention of the most influential patrons he could possibly secure. At La Rábida, now a carefully restored monument dating from the 14th and 15th centuries, Columbus won the support of another Franciscan friar living in the convent, Antonio Marchena. A noted astrologer and cosmographer, Marchena became Columbus's first confidant in Spain and brought his project to the attention of the Queen and powerful Castilian magnates. One can imagine Marchena, Perez, and other friars gathering in La Rábida's reception room to discuss their guests' theories of discovering a new passage to the riches of Asia. During his refuge in the convent, Columbus received backing from Spain's most powerful churchmen, the Archbishop of Toledo, Cardinal Mendoza, whose statuette appears on Rogers' doors. But in the end, it was Friar Perez who persuaded Queen Isabella to reconsider the project of his dispirited friend who was preparing to leave Spain. Recalled to court, Columbus stands before the thrones of Ferdinand and Isabella in the door's third narrative panel. While Isabella leans forward to examine the outlines of an imaginary Asian continent at the top of a mat held up for her inspection, Ferdinand adopts a stiff pose of impenetrable reserve. Rogers shows that it is the Queen of Castile rather than the King of Aragon who will become Columbus's patron. Distrustful of the Italian adventurer, Ferdinand refused to support his venture. The king's skeptical character is revealed in the dour, rough-hewn features of this contemporary portrait. Despite her more serene disposition, a contrasting portrait of the devout queen discloses her formidable will. Isabella's lifelong friend and confidant, Lady Beatrix de Bobadilla, a champion of Columbus since their meeting at the La Rábida convent, pleaded with the queen to overcome her hesitancy by pointing to the Genoese mariner's divine inspiration. The statuette of Beatrix on Rogers' doors honors her influence in helping to change Isabella's mind. Most sources credit the personal intervention of the king's financial advisor, Luis Senangel, in overcoming Isabella's lingering financial concerns, expressing his surprise that a monarch renowned for her resolute spirit would think twice about an enterprise that offered so little risk, yet could prove of so great service to the glory of her realms and kingdoms. Santangel secured loans from a consortia of bankers together with his own funds to provide initial financing for the expedition. Following protracted negotiations, the Catholic monarch signed a contract with Columbus in the fortress of Santa Fe outside the fallen Moorish stronghold of Granada on April 17, 1492. Insisting that the power couple grant him the hereditary offices of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor of all the new lands he might succeed in discovering, in addition to 10% of all profits gained from them. In the end, Columbus realized all his demands. The fourth panel of the doors depicts the historic scene on the morning of August 3rd, 1492, when Columbus embarked from the small Andalusian port of Palos to set out on his momentous voyage. In the center of the composition, the cowled figure of Friar Perez blesses his intrepid Genoese friend and his sailors while protectively clutching the hand of the mariner's son, Diego. At the bottom left of the panel, the wives of Columbus's crew tearfully say farewell to their husbands, while one sailor holds his infant aloft for a last look before setting off on a perilous journey across unknown waters. In the upper left corner, the fortress-like Church of St. George looms over the waterfront next to a cross-top watchtower, which may well be an invention of the artist. Following the celebration of Holy Communion and hearing of confession, Columbus's crew filed out of the church through a massive portal down to the wharf, where they boarded small boats to reach the 3 ships anchored in the Palos harbor. We can picture the 90 pilots, seamen, crown officials, and their 20 to 30 servants who crewed the sailing vessels scrambling down the waterfront to waiting rowboats in this late 16th century engraving. Returning to our panel scene, the prominence of Friar Paris underlines his centrality in the Columbus story. When the explorer encountered difficulty in finding seamen willing to sail on his expedition to the Indies, the Franciscan used his great influence among the mariners of Palos and the surrounding region to recruit crewmen willing to risk their lives for such an uncertain and risky venture. Local mariners were encouraged to sign on when Perez introduced Columbus to Palos's most prestigious shipowner and renowned navigator, Martin Alonso Pinzon. Fully committing himself to Columbus's plan, Martin Pinzon put up half the sum of money provided by the court from his own fortune to finance the voyage. Rejecting the crew and the 2 ships selected by Columbus, Pinzon took it upon himself to enlist the best sailors and supplied 2 caravels seaworthy enough for an Atlantic crossing, nicknamed the Niña and the Pinta. While Martin Pinzon captained the Pinta, his brother Vicente piloted the Niña, and a 3rd Pinzon brother, Francisco, served as the Niña's master. The fleet's 3rd vessel, a larger cargo ship, the Santa Maria, was leased by Columbus from its co-owner, Juan de la Cosa, a famed navigator and cartographer who piloted the admiral's flagship. Replicas of Columbus's ships were built by Spain for the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. More recently, in 1991, a replica of the Niña was constructed in Brazil employing 15th century technology. Used in the filming of the 1992 epic Conquest of Paradise, it visited many ports around the world. A photo of the replica shows us the diminutive 50 to 60-foot length of this sleek, maneuverable caravel, whose lightweight construction proved ideal for navigating shallow island coastlines. They were designed for Mediterranean trade, but not the rough waters and violent storms of the Atlantic. With no sight of land after a month at sea, Martin Pinzon twice averted mutiny by the fleet's desperate crew before an island was finally sighted on the 35th day of the voyage. Placing a bust of Columbus at the apex of the casing, framing the curved doors, Rogers filled the space below the arch with a scene showing Columbus landing on a Bahamian island, believed to be Guanahani, the indigenous name which the discoverer rechristened San Salvador on October 12, 1492. In a solemn ceremonial act, he raises his sword while planting a royal banner to claim the island for the Spanish king. To depict the theatrical staging of this ritual of conquest, Rogers adheres to a highly conventional iconography for the group of figures surrounding Columbus in the center of the tympanum, influenced perhaps by the 1843 Rotunda painting of the same moment in history by John Vanderlyn. Vanderlyn's backdrop of a lone, non-tropical tree is replicated in Rogers' relief. Both artists use the tree to demarcate the disproportionate space in their compositions devoted to the dominant colonizers versus the marginalized natives who cower in submission. Both landings foreshadow Columbus's taking possession of not only an island, but by this act of conquest, taking possession of its natives' rights to their land, their culture, and personal freedom. At one stroke, the naked, timorous children of nature are subjugated by a motley crew of European adventurers, bristling with steel weapons and armor, outlandishly clad in Renaissance doublets, stockings, and cavalier hats. The figural reliefs at each end of the tympanum, or lunette, are more imaginatively rendered. In the left corner, members of the landing party row ashore. The right corner relief of Taino natives crouching behind a tree effectively conveys their awe and fear at the bewildering sight of ships and men from heaven. Their peaceful presence is menaced by a heavily armed Spanish guard with a hunting dog, though Columbus attested that the natives do not bear arms and do not know them. In his letters to San Angel, Ferdinand, and Isabella, Columbus evokes a paradise surpassing human belief, filled with rich and fertile plains, hills, and mountains, health-giving rivers, and fine harbors abounding in a great variety of fruits and birds. Living in primitive simplicity, the indigenous inhabitants seemed almost as if they were existing in the state of primeval innocence. Guileless and honest, Columbus marveled that the natives showed the greatest affection toward all of us, willing to trade everything they owned for a worthless trifle or even nothing. Into this Edenic setting, the top panel on the right valve introduces a note of evil for the first time in the scene depicting Columbus's initial encounter with the indigenous inhabitants he called Indians, in the mistaken belief that the Caribbean islands he discovered were the Indies. Rogers' lofty and noble hero is suddenly forced to confront an act of violence against the natives of the island by one of his rapacious sailors. Clearly, the artist's portrayal of the muscular crewman's seizure of a Taino woman was influenced by the numerous representations of abduction surrounding him in Florence and Rome by famous 16th and 17th century sculptors like Jean Bologna and Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Turning our attention back to the central figures of Columbus and his clerical companion, the commanding gesture of the admiral signals his disapproval of the fate of the Taino natives at the hands of his Spanish countrymen. We can see the frown on his face more clearly in this detail. By opposing the violence visited upon the defenseless natives with the benign paternalism of his hero, Rogers attempts to transfer the blame for the destructive policies of European colonialism in the New World on Columbus's followers, who are portrayed in Irving's biography as ethnocentric bigots, rapists, and murderers driven by unslakable avarice. The presence of the priest at Columbus's side underlines the critical importance of the church in colonizing the newly discovered lands by bringing the blessings of religion as well as European civilization to the New World. But was Columbus any different from his countrymen in viewing the natives as a resource to be exploited? Columbus's fatherly concern for Native Americans, as depicted in this panel scene, is belied by his own accounts. In his journal, he stated that on his very first day on San Salvador, he ordered his men to seize 6 natives, believing they would make good servants. By the time of his 4th and last voyage in 1502, thousands of Taino from the island named Hispaniola by its discoverer had been transported to Spain to be sold into slavery. Those natives who remained on the island were coerced into brutal forced labor, mining alluvial gold, and on plantations under Columbus's governorship. The genocidal nature of European colonialism is starkly revealed by the fact that 60 years after Columbus landed on Hispaniola, only a few hundred Taino out of a population of what may have been as large as 250,000 survived. The first encounter with the Indians turned out to be a fatal encounter. Despite Rogers' inclusion of a priest in both the tympanum scene and the top right panel, No records, including Columbus's own report, substantiate the presence of a priest or chaplain among the 110 or 120 crew members on the first voyage. Friar Perez is believed to have accompanied Columbus's second voyage and is generally credited with celebrating the first Catholic Mass in the New World on December 8th, 1493. For his sixth panel, Rogers selected the moment of his hero's triumphal entry into Barcelona, 1 month after his ship returned to Palos on March 15, 1493. Cheering crowds line the entrance to the royal castle where Ferdinand and Isabella await their guest's arrival. Escorted by knights of the realm, Columbus rides past the welcoming throngs to receive his lifelong ambition, a title of nobility, together with royal confirmation of all his provisional offices, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor of the islands he discovered. As part of a spectacular parade en route to his audience with the monarchs, 2 of the 8 Taino natives who survived their kidnapping march ahead of the mounted conqueror turned showman. The female captive holds a parrot above her head, while her male companion carries a bow to fit the image of an exotic trophy on display. To add color to the spectacle, a squad of sailors from the Nina follow the Native Americans, exhibiting tropical birds, animals, spices, and plants brought back from Hispaniola, including a 5-foot-long iguana. Enticed by Columbus's stories of great mines of gold and other riches in their new possessions, despite the meager treasures he brought back from his first voyage, the Spanish rulers decided to equip him with a huge fleet of 17 ships for his second expedition to the New World. No El Dorado, however, was discovered on Columbus's second voyage in 1493 and his third voyage in 1498. Fame and glory proved fleeting, while bitter disappointments lay ahead. This dramatic reversal of fortune is depicted in Rogers' 7th panel. The explorer who opened the gates of the ocean, the courageous discoverer who overcame adversity to change history, suffered humiliation and disgrace when he was arrested by Francisco de Bobadilla, a royal commissioner and judge sent by the court to investigate reports of the Columbus brothers' misgovernance at Hispaniola. Ironically, this fierce knight of Castile's oldest military order was reputed to be the brother of Beatrix de Bobadilla, Columbus's great champion in the royal court. A late 16th century engraving illustrates Francisco Bobadilla in the act of having Columbus placed in chains after his arrest following serious charges of atrocities. Far from indicating any sign of mass discontent on the unfortunate island, Columbus is portrayed by Rogers as the innocent party, a righteous man whose persecution, with analogies to Christ's passion, causes horrified onlookers gathered on the waterfront to cry out as their governor is led to the ship sent to return him to Spain for trial. Even a group of natives incongruously join the Spanish colonists in mourning the removal of a despot whose inept iron rule sparked a bloody rebellion which he savagely repressed. Like the La Rábida and Palos panel scenes, Columbus in Chains is also a moment of departure. Ignoring the reign of terror that convulsed Hispaniola, Rogers' composition emphasizes the hero's moral greatness, his fortitude and perseverance in the face of misfortune. When the captain of the homeward-bound ship offered to remove Columbus's shackles, he stoically replied, "I will wear them as a reminder of the gratitude of princes. In the end, Columbus had good reason to thank the gratitude of Ferdinand, who ordered him released from prison after 6 weeks. Following a court acquittal, the joint monarchs restored some of the titles and honors withdrawn after Columbus's arrest and agreed to fund his fourth and final voyage in 1502. On this expedition, which explored the coast of Central America, Columbus was accompanied by his brother Bartholomew, whose statuette appears on the right side of the panel. Bartholomew, who had previously served as acting governor of Hispaniola in Christopher's absence, was also arrested in 1500 and returned to stand trial in Spain. Like his brother, all charges against Bartholomew were dropped. Rogers concluded the story of Columbus with his death on May 20th, 1506, at the age of 54. Worn out from his voyages, racked by crippling arthritis, and largely forgotten, the great explorer is surrounded by a few friends as the last rites of the Catholic Church are administered. Bending toward the dying man, a priest holds up a crucifix for him to kiss on his deathbed. Shortly before his approaching demise, consumed with self-pity, Columbus wrote to the court begging for sympathy. All that was left to me and to my brothers has been taken away and sold. I am ruined. Hitherto I have wept for others. Now have pity upon me, heaven, and weep for me, earth. Despite Columbus's protestations of impoverishment and ruin, his share of the gold brought back on his first and second voyages allowed him to live out the last years of his life in relative comfort. Both his sons, Diego and Ferdinand, enjoyed royal favor at court. 2 years after Columbus's death, King Ferdinand named Diego as governor of the Indies, and a royal council confirmed the hereditary titles of viceroy and admiral previously held by his father. Although the promise of a tenth of the profit from the new lands was subsequently denied by the crown after Columbus's arrest, his heirs secured substantial wealth and property after winning a long-running lawsuit against the court. While Columbus suffered disappointment and humiliation, ultimately he attained his ambition of procuring a fortune and noble status for his family. Pope Alexander VI, whose statuette appears at the top of the left door, not only used his authority to immediately confirm Spain's rightful possession of its new lands, but also on his own initiative granted a coat of arms to Columbus and his descendants, the House of Colon. The attempts by Irving and Rogers to heroicize Columbus, imbuing him with a lofty and magnanimous spirit, are contradicted by the self-seeking aspects of a fortune hunter. To understand Columbus, we must view him as a deeply pious, late medieval man whose conduct mirrored the values of his age. The increasingly mystical navigator presented his quest for gold as a religious mission to fund a new crusade to recapture the Holy Land for the Christian faith. With a worldview inspired by Marco Polo's 13th century account of the Orient, he could not imagine that the Caribbean islands he discovered lay offshore 2 unknown continents, subsequently named America, for his friend and rival explorer, Amerigo Vespucci. A Latinized version of Amerigo, America, was invented by a German cartographer who published the first map of the world in 1507, showing the Western Hemisphere as a separate landmass bounded by the Pacific Ocean. Emulating female personification of the known continents on maps since the Renaissance, Rogers proudly added America to the allegories of her African, Asian, and European sisters on each corner of the door casing. Over the course of the next 4 decades, Columbus's discoveries were eclipsed by the conquests of Balboa, Cortez, and Pizarro, whose statuettes fill the door's niches. But it was Columbus who opened a new chapter in the age of explorations thanks to his indomitable will and stubborn persistence despite all the obstacles in his path. Regardless of the controversies today surrounding Columbus and the consequences of his landfall in the New World, Randolph Rogers' magnificent doors constitute one of the U.S. Capitol's greatest art treasures. When the sculptor completed the modeling of the reliefs in 1858, the mold was sent to Munich, where it was cast into bronze at the Royal Bavarian Foundry in 1860. 3 years later, the nearly 17-foot-high, 20,000-pound portals arrived in Washington, where they were installed in front of the Capitol's connecting corridors leading to the House of Representatives. In 1871, the doors were moved to a much more prominent position at the central entrance leading to the Rotunda on the east front. Following the extension of the east front in 1961, the Columbus doors were shifted to their present imposing location at the top of the stairs leading to the second floor of the Capitol.